Welcome to this episode of the Full Circle Podcast. I'm just one of your hosts, David Roberts. I have with me the OG, Dr. Neil Holmes, and absent today is the oral historian, Andre Taylor. But we more than make up for Andre's absence because we have a very special guest with us today. We have brother Dr. Raymond Winbush. Dr. Winbush, welcome, sir.
Hey, good to see you, Dave and Neil.
Now, just so to lay the groundwork, recently I was on LinkedIn because you're one of my LinkedIn connections. I don't even remember how we became LinkedIn connections, but then I saw some comments you had made about the movie Judas and the Black Messiah, the recent movie that outlines the assassination, the murder, whatever we want to call it, of brother Fred Hampton of the Black Panther Party, the chairman. And I liked your comments so much that I said, hey, can you come on, our podcast and talk about this? And that was just from your comments. And so then, was it Friday or I think Saturday night, I'm watching a movie with my family and the credits start rolling and I see your name, I get excited like a little kid. He gonna be on our show. He gonna be talking about this, So I didn't know I'd hit the jackpot when you agreed to come on. So we want to thank you for coming on. Now, why don't you talk to us a little bit about, actually, before we get into how you got involved with Judas and the Black Messiah, for the uninitiated, which I was one of the uninitiated back in 1990 when I first saw that episode of Eyes on the Prize.
Yeah.
For the uninitiated, why don't you tell them who Fred Hampton was and how amazing he was?
Well, boy, I'll give you a snapshot of it. Fred Hampton, I consider him, Malcolm, Marcus, and Fred as being, three or four of the greatest organizers of the 20th century. Is that simple? I mean, Fred Hampton was leader of the Illinois Black Panther Party. At 19, he was organizing the entire city of Chicago. When I say entire city, it was literally that. In the film, we talk about this group called the Crowns, but that was really the Blackstone Rangers. I was in Chicago 6 months after Fred was assassinated. When we made this film, we agreed that we would never use the term murder because he was assassinated. And he organized the Young Patriots, which was a white group, the Young Lords, which was a Puerto Rican group, the Black Panthers, obviously, and the Black Keystone Nation, El Rukans, and at that time, Blackstone Rangers. So, I mean, he was just a great organizer, and the threat was that he was organizing. One of the things that we don't attribute to Fred Hampton and specifically to the Black Panthers is that the reason why we have school breakfast programs today is because the Black Panther Party initiated that. And that's what really set off J. Edgar Hoover at the FBI, because he knew that if you fed people, they were going to love you. And so all of that, Fred did all of that before he was 21 years old, which was absolutely amazing. So, I mean, I could go on and on about Fred. You asked me some questions because he was, like I said, he is the epitome of Black leadership and young people. And one of the things we hope that the film does is, give him as a role model to some of the young people in Black Lives Matter and other movements, because that kind of leadership we don't have today. I'm being very honest. We just don't have that type of leadership now.
And you know what's interesting when you talk about that type of leadership? I remember when I first saw that piece, that Eyes on the Prize piece that they referenced in Judas and the Black Messiah, and I was very angry for two reasons. One, I was angry about what happened. But then two, I was angry because at that time, I considered myself woke. We weren't using that term back in 1990, but I considered myself woke. And I was like, why have I never heard of Fred Hampton? And, I was in my junior year of college, had gone through, 12 years of primary school, we would call it primary and secondary. So that means I had 12 Black History months. And I always heard of Martin Luther King, Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass, Jackie Robinson. Respect them all.
Right.
But I never heard of Fred Hampton. And why is that? Do you feel that because of some of the things you cited, that his memory is suppressed by the powers that be.
Yeah, well, Black revolutionaries are never afforded a place in contemporary history. I mean, they don't want us to know about those heroes and sheroes that liberated us. I mean, we could make films now about Denmark Vesey. We could make films about Gabriel Prosser, who a lot of people haven't heard about, but who were the revolutionaries. They give us people, and I'm saying they give us people to memorialize that they feel safe with. I mean, you look at Malcolm X. Malcolm X just became safe, if you please, after Spike made his film in the mid-90s.
Right.
You heard very little about Malcolm X prior to that. For those of us who remember him, we heard a lot about him. And, when Charles King, who produced this film, and Ryan Coogler, who directed Black Panther, when they approached me about making the film, Charles King was my student. He is now one of the biggest Black producers in Hollywood. He produced a film, I don't know if you saw Thurgood, and he did Denzel's film.
That.
He did Denzel's film Fences. He always told me when he was a student that he was going to Hollywood. I only kind of half believed that he was going to do that, but he said that he was going to make films that were positive representation of those who have been neglected by history. And I put the emphasis on his story. And so he called me up and said, Dr. Ray, can you consult with Ryan Coogler, the Black Panther? And I said, sure. I said, can we meet? So we did. We met in Coogler and I met in Chicago in like April of 18. And we said we're going to make the film. And I said, as long as it's authentic, I said, you can have literary license, but we got to keep the story of Fred up front. So the film was initially called Jesus Was My Homeboy, and we changed the name to Judas and the Black Messiah because we wanted to take the Judas that was in the Bible, because Bill O'Neill betrayed Fred Hampton. He was working with the FBI. He drugged Fred's soup with a barbiturate the night that he was assassinated in Chicago. And that's why Fred was asleep when he was assassinated. And we depict that in the film. And Deborah, his fiance, covered him up so that he wouldn't be shot. And Deborah told the actress to not cry because Fred told her not to cry if they killed me. So when she left out of the room, and that's depicted in the film as well, when she left out of the room, Fred was still alive. The only person who had been killed at that point was Mark Clark, who answered the door, and they just shot him through the door. So, in real life, the Chicago cop went in there, saw that Fred was still alive, and put 2 bullets in the back of his head while he was asleep.
Wow.
So it's and see, I think the other thing, David, we rarely talk about, and when we get together, we don't talk about that many people who betrayed us. But there were a lot of Black betrayers of us to white folks for centuries. I mean, you can go back to Gabriel Prosser, as I mentioned earlier, in Virginia. He was betrayed. Denmark Vesey, who was in South Carolina, he was going to organize the greatest rebellion up until that time in this country's history. He was betrayed at the last minute. You can go on and on. The first Black FBI agent hired in this country was hired specific. I think his name was William Jones. He was hired to spy on Marcus Garvey. And so we got Black betrayers right now. One's on the Supreme Court named Clarence Thomas, So we decided to focus the movie on the relationship between Fred and O'Neill as a way of us starting a dialogue about that. which is, I think, very important. I'll tell you another guy that was betrayed. The guy that took the pictures of Martin Luther King was working with the FBI. So it's something that we, did in the film. This was what I call a real Black film. It had a Black producer, a Black director, a Black screenplay writer, a Black researcher. Everything was Black. The New York Times, in fact, yesterday said it was the most revolutionary film to come out of Hollywood. Now that's a low bar, but at the same time, it's a truly Black film. No white heroes, and we told each other we were not going to put any white heroes in this film, which you see a lot, but we put Black folk up front, told their story, and let white people revolve around them.
So how do we take the film? How do we initiate that conversation about those sellouts, betrayers? And one of the things that's interesting is that they often find themselves in the security apparatus of organizations. Right. And so how do we really push that conversation out there?
Well, man, I'm going to tell you, that's the $64,000 question, because I'm going to tell you what's up. Like, I could name a Black betrayer right now. I'm talking about his living today. But if I did, I'm going to get in trouble. Y'all know him too, but I'm not going to mention his name. We know this guy. I'm going to use him as an anonymous example. We know that he has infiltrated the Black community, that he is considered a Black leader right now in the Black community, has worked and has a history with the FBI. The problem is that the betrayers, the Judases, if you please, in our community are usually identified after they have been successful in assassinating or betraying one of our leaders. So we know, for example, I did the fact checking for the new book on Malcolm, Our People Are Rising. And when the guy that breathed into Malcolm's mouth when he was laying there assassinated on the stage worked for the NYPD. Yeah. So we usually identify these people after the fact, because if you identify them while they're alive and doing their dirt, you get, oh man, you just a hater. Or, they'll make you feel like somehow you're giving disinformation about somebody. But these people are among us today. They stay among us. They've always been with us.
What's interesting, I remember years ago when I think maybe Jesse Jackson was running for the presidency back, was it 88, maybe?
84, I think.
84, and I think
84 and 88, he ran both.
Yeah, both, that's right, both times, right.
He used the term Hymietown privately to a Black reporter, and the Black reporter exposed him. And then Farrakhan called that reporter out and said, he just said, it sounded threatening, but said, you are a traitor, and at some point we will be able to punish you with death. But he was just talking about how America punishes their traitors, because the penalty for treason is death. Unless you're the Confederacy, then you're forgiven. but the penalty for treason is supposed to be death. And when he brought that up, Farrakhan was vilified as opposed to that traitor. And I thought that was interesting.
Well, I mean, you're absolutely right. It's almost like, Dave, that the people who have the monopoly on violence are white people. So we can't even sanction our own people that betray us. We have to turn to the white folks to do that. And the fact of the matter is that we see this unfolding in this film. O'Neill, I'll tell you we had to have that. If you saw the film we had to give a lengthy, afterward about it. What's interesting about O'Neill betraying Fred was that he committed suicide the day you were looking at Eyes on the Prize. You probably know that.
Right.
And the way he committed suicide, we didn't put that in the film, but when I was doing the research in Chicago, the way he committed suicide, he ran out on the Eisenhower Expressway, one of the busiest expressways in Chicago, other than the Dan Ryan, at night and got hit by a car. What's even more fascinating is that the morning that he committed suicide, another man who was living in the same apartment committed suicide the same way. Now, we were torn with the movie. Was that a coincidence that two black men ran out in the Eisenhower Expressway, or did they get the wrong man and the FBI actually killed O'Neill? We don't know. Deborah went to William O'Neill's, that was Fred Hampton's fiance. She went to his funeral, and she looked in and she says that she was going to spit on him and push the coffin over because, and when she looked in the coffin, it wasn't William O'Neill.
Wow.
So to this day, we're not even sure William O'Neill is still alive. We're not sure. He would be in his late 60s right now. So we don't know.
Wow. Now, go ahead, Neil.
Yeah, one of the things that's sort of interesting is just about this time, Richard Nixon was sitting with his advisors, and he said, we have to, the biggest problem we have, and later he wrote an article, and he's saying the problem the United States faces is China. The two big problems are China and the African community. Right. But at this time, he was sitting with his advisors and said, we have to treat the Negro differently without looking like we're treating the Negro differently. Mm-hmm. And we began to see this backlash or front lash or whatever, this intensification of oppression in our communities with drug, what some people call chemical warfare in terms of drugs. Right. And this policing, over-policing, or so. How do you put Fred Hampton, the Black Panthers, within that frame, within that period?
Well, that's a good question. The Panthers came, 66. Bobby Seale and Huey Newton organized them in Oakland. Came at the time right after the civil rights movement and 2 years before King was assassinated. Some people call that the blackest period in the past 100 years of our existence. King had just been martyred and so forth. The Panthers, if I were to critique the Panthers, I don't think they anticipated how violent this country would be towards them asserting themselves as they did as armed revolutionaries. Guns in our community have always been. There's a book out now called "We Will Shoot Back." Right. Akinye Umoja's, a good brother down in Georgia, and we know that Charles Evers, Medgar Evers' brother, told Dr. King, "Look, we ain't into this nonviolent stuff." Mm-hmm. If you go back to the 1920s, the Black Blood Brotherhood that was organized by, what's his name, Cyril, I forget his last name. He's a Black Marxist. The Deacons of Defense, right. The Republic of New Africa. Mm-hmm. All of these groups were there. It's only now that we're taking guns and self-defense off the table. And I think that happened when the Panthers were systematically wiped out, on East 41st in Los Angeles, the shootout that was in Philadelphia, Fred Hampton, all of those things had occurred. And I think that the Panthers didn't anticipate how rough that period was going to be. Kathleen Cleaver Eldridge's widow is a good friend of mine, and we talked at length about this. There was this attempt to just destroy the Panthers, wipe them out. Hoover said they were considered the most dangerous black group in this country. You probably are familiar with the shootout at UCLA when Bunchy Carter was killed. And what a lot of people don't know, the guy that was chairing that meeting was a guy named Arthur Williams, who later on became Malefi Asante and a chairman of the Black Studies at Temple University and founder of Afrocentricity. But what's her name? And I ain't gonna mention her name either. She worked for the FBI, the one who set up Bunchy Carter at that shootout. So they were completely infiltrated. And I think the Panthers, they had an understanding of history, but I think they knew that there would be violence meted against them, and they were going to meet it with them, but they didn't know how bad it was going to get. So you see that period from 66 to roughly 73 where the Panthers were wiped out.
Yeah. And we talked about that, Neil, in a class you taught. I can't remember because I took a couple of your classes at the University of Akron, but you just talked about how the movement was crushed, know. And I think you made the point that the Klan has been around since 1865, still going strong. They've gone up and down.
Yeah.
And they have been infiltrated by the FBI, but never just totally crushed.
Never.
And
they could have been crushed if they wanted to. But this whole idea of a Black Messiah, and that's something we should mention too. We use the term, or Fred used the term, Rainbow Coalition, and Jesse kind of co-opted that term, but Fred Hampton was the person who initially used the term the Rainbow Coalition. And I think that Hoover saw this idea of a Black Messiah. He saw it in King, he saw it in Malcolm, he saw it in Fred Hampton. He didn't want a Black leader to arise that would unite Black folk across this country. So in one sense, and this is a difficult admission, but in one sense, they were successful because who are the Black leaders now? In my book, The Warrior Method, I use Wade Noble's term Jegna. And Jegna is an Aramaic word that means a person that knows their community's history, everything, but they will die for their community. They will sacrifice their life to protect the community. We ain't got no Jegnas now. We had them then, Fred, Malcolm, King, we had them then. We don't have any Jegnas in our community right now. And some people may disagree with me on that, but when I see national Black leadership, I see Minister Farrakhan as one of the few unbought people. I don't see that many more. I just don't.
Well, I think one of the problems we have is, the HUD office out of Detroit put out a memo, and they said, the problem we're facing in this country, from their perspective, is Black power. To deal with Black power, we have to destroy the Black community. They said the Black ghetto, and so we've had we've been dispersed, and we've had so many dispersals, and the way we're dispersed is interesting. I was down in New Orleans right after Katrina hit. And I talked to a sister who was one of the bus drivers. And they were driving people out of the city. Mm-hmm. They wouldn't allow whole families to get on the same bus. Mm-hmm. They scattered them about. Then I went into the Vietnamese community where they brought the Vietnamese that opposed the revolution over. They brought whole villages over intact into New Orleans. And so there's a method to their attack and undermining of our movements and undermining of our ability to create leadership.
You're right. And someone, I'm a psychologist by trade, and someone said right after the Katrina dispersal, the suicide rate among Black New Orleans just skyrocketed because that separation and dispersal which again is a tactic of the system of white supremacy ever since we were, stolen from Africa. That they've always separated us by language, by family, the selling, as the greatest fear of enslaved Africans on so-called plantations was to be sold. That was the greatest fear because of not wanting to be separated. So they've always used that as a tactic.
And to me, I know I've never understood the fear in a way of Africans in America or Africans period, because I think we've shown historically and traditionally that we just want to prosper. We've never been a people to say, okay, we're going to get in this position and do to you what you did to us. Right. Whatever. We just, anytime we had an opportunity, whether it was Reconstruction or whatever, we just wanted to prosper and move on and be with our families. So what's the root of the fear?
Well, I'm going to tell you, this is really going to be at the part, but, I just read Frank Wilderson's book, Afro-Pessimism. And, Wilderson teaches, I think he's Black Studies chair at University of California, Irvine. Wilderson argues that no matter what African people do, and I'm talking about the global African community,
right?
If we invented a pill that could cure cancer, AIDS, COVID, and sold it for $5 or gave it away, he says no matter what we do as African people, white people will always see us as subhuman. No matter what we do, it doesn't make a difference. And that's why he calls his theory Afro-pessimism. So the idea, like you're right, we only want to prosper and do not what white folks do, that any human being on this planet wants to do. Raise families, make sure our children are safe, health, food, and so forth and so on. And the proof of that they don't want us to do that is, we could point to examples like Black Wall Street, we could point to Rosewood, and this divide between us is so, and I'm talking about between Black people and white people, is so great. Wilderson argues that it's never going to be bridged, that we should adapt the phrase, and he said it's a liberation thought, that no white people will ever want us to prosper. And that's the Afro-pessimism about this whole thing.
Okay.
And it's a it's a pessimistic theory, but you look at history and I can't disprove what he argues, because when we leave everybody alone, I went out to Black Wall Street in Tulsa a few years ago just to see it firsthand. And there's a little town right outside of there called Redbird, Oklahoma. It's about 30, 40 miles away. And all the people there are descendants of those who were killed during Black Wall Street. And the old sister told me that the big mistake they made in Black Wall Street is that they did not have enough guns. That's what they said. They did not have enough guns. They fought, but 300 of us, at least we know, were killed. John Hope Franklin was one of my teachers when I was doing my doctorate. And John Hope Franklin's dad, Buck Franklin, was the lawyer for them. And Dr. Franklin used to tell us, he said, white people just don't want us to prosper. They don't want us to prosper. They see it as being some kind of threat to them. And I think, I'm not trying, but my latest book is about Dr. Frances Cress Welsing. I wrote a book or edited a book with Dr. Welsing, who made her transition a few years ago. And I think it's because they see themselves as a minority status, which they are on this planet. There's only 8% of the world's population is classified as white, and they feel intimidated by the presence of Black, brown, red people.
Yeah. Now, now how about, how would you look at the Young Patriots? I remember the first time I went to a Panther meeting in Virginia, here in Richmond.
Yeah.
This guy come out. This guy named Preacher Man came out, and I was there with this brother who was a brown beret, this Chicano brother. Yeah. And he said, "Hey, home, we might have to fight up here." And Preacher Man came up there and said, "I was taught to hate black people and that black people were my enemy. But the Black Panther Party taught me that racism, capitalism, imperialism was my enemy." Do you think there's a limit to how far that thinking can go amongst whites?
Well, see, it's different times. Like, I call it 1621, and because that was 1621 when they hit the Capitol near here in Baltimore. That those white people that raided that Capitol and did all of that stuff, they have more in common with poor and middle-class black folk than they do a failed billionaire named Donald Trump. But see, again, Neil, it's like Derek Bell says in Faces at the Bottom of the Well. White people have been sold this bill of goods that their skin color is more important than class or anything else. Remember in Invisible Man when Ralph Ellison is telling his story and he's beating up this white man, got him on the ground, just beating him up. And he said, no matter what the white man says, the character, he said, no matter what you do, you still a nigger. And I think white people, and Derek Bell says the same thing, white people have been taught very effectively that the worst white man, the snagger-tooth guy living in Appalachia that sells moonshine, is better than any of the three of us on this phone. And because we don't, so what Fred did with the Patriots and Preacher Man, I know you had met Preacher Man, but Preacher Man, for that brief time, those poor whites on the west side of Chicago, they saw class as a more important than race. But that's rare among white people. I'm telling you. Yeah. And black nationalists, which Chicago was the seat of black nationalism. And I always tell people the Panthers weren't nationalists. They were primarily Marxists, and they saw class as the big thing. And, I think that people like Preacher Man are exception rather than the rule. That's my opinion.
But what's fascinating to me is that Martin Luther King tried that same message, and those Appalachian whites rejected him. He said this is worse than Mississippi. And then this young Fred Hampton, 19, 20 years old, he was able to accomplish what this established, at that time, this established leader could not accomplish. So, I mean, that's just, to me, another feather in his cap,
Yeah, I mean, Fred, and it's accurate what we show in the movie. He would walk into, and he literally walked into Preacher Man talking that stuff. Fred was fearless. I mean, he had no fear whatsoever. When he walked into we call them the Crowns, but in real life it's Blackstone Rangers, as I said. He walked right in. That was Jeff Fort. I don't know if y'all know who Jeff Fort was.
Yeah.
But I have an encounter with Jeff Fort. He was the leader of the Stones, man. Look, Jeff Fort was no joke. But he eventually became very close friends with Fred Hampton and probably was singularly responsible for Jeff Fort evolving the Blackstone Nation into more of a group like what Fred wanted. So, but man, we just don't see, that takes incredible leadership.
Right.
Again, I'm not trying to sound pessimistic, but I'm not sure that kind of leadership exists right now. We say Black Lives Matter, and I'm not trying to cast aspersion on them, but, and now I just won't say anything. I won't say
what differences do you see in between the Black Lives Matters movement and the Black Power movement of the 60s and 70s?
Well, I don't think that I think the Black Lives Matter movement asks for permission too much. I do not like the phrase "hands up, don't shoot." I got issues with the term Black Lives Matter because it's clearly they matter to us. They don't matter to white people, you know. But I think we said, even Dr. King's movement said, we shall overcome. Like that was a, you know, an assertion. This idea of hands up, don't shoot, and kind of this passive, just stating this, you know, I'm rereading Kwame Ture's biography, Ready for Revolution. And, you know, Kwame, they use nonviolence very differently. They wanted to disrupt cities, and they did.
Right.
Dr. King did it. You know, Black Lives Matter does some of that, you know, but not all of it. And then the other thing is who funds you controls you. And I'm sorry, you know, Dr. King went around, he would preach, and they would pay him, and he would pay his, you know, we're getting, I mean, a lot of people in Black Lives Matter, not a lot of people, but much of the leadership, they're millionaires. They got money, and they're getting money. And I'm not, I know this is going to be out. Some people get upset about it, but I think we got to be for real about how we organize right now. And our organization right now, compared to the 60s, it's just, it's more philosophical, you know, and less said, how are we going to direct certain things? Like, you know, Fred Hampton was, I mean, he was going to form that Rainbow Coalition, as he's called it. And they were planning on policing their own neighborhoods, having breakfast programs all over the city of Chicago, all that. I'm not sure I see that in Black Lives Matter. And I've met with some of their leadership.
Now, Dr. Winbush, since we have a few minutes left, I do want to switch gears for a minute. Sure. Because in researching you, I saw that you've done a lot with reparations. You know, a lot of research, you've done presentations on reparations. Can we talk a little bit about this House bill that's coming up about, you know, on reparations? For those who don't know, can you tell us a little bit about it and then let us know what you think about it?
Well, in 1989, the late John Conyers introduced a bill called H.R. 40. And it called for a study of reparations. It didn't call for reparations, it called for a study of it. Because if you look at the Japanese indigenous people of this country, you always do a congressional study about the impact of the crime against humanity towards groups. The bill never got out of Congress. It never got out of Congress, out of committee, I should say. About 3 or 4 years ago, Cam Howard, the co-chair, national co-chair of NCOBRA, which is the main group for reparations, National Coalition of Blacks for Reparations in America, he and myself and Kichi Taifa, an attorney, we revised it, gave it to Sheila Jackson Lee. And so today, in fact, they had a hearing in Congress. There was supposed to be one last year, but about the COVID, and then we had one a year before last on Juneteenth about it. The issue for reparations is very simple. When a crime against humanity has been committed, there is no statutes of limitation on it, and the people who are affected by that crime against humanity deserve repair or reparations. It's an acknowledgement that a nation has committed a crime against humanity. And so we see reparations, as I always say, they're as American as apple pie. The one group that hasn't gotten them, of course, is us. And so I've written a couple books, Should America Pay? And also one called Belinda's Petition about reparations. And it is something that is happening now. Some people call me and say, Ray, we ain't never gonna get reparations. I said, well, tell that to the people of Evanston, Illinois, because we just got them $10 million to buy homes because they have been discriminated against with reparations. There are bills now, the state of California has set up a statewide commission on reparation. Governor Newsom, there are bills in Burlington, Vermont, the whitest state of the union, in Asheville, North Carolina, Chicago, and several places. Reparations are going to happen. African, it's funny how white folks, after I make a presentation, white folks will come up to me and say, Dr. Winfrey, how much do we owe you? They know it. Black folk will come up to me afterwards and say, and they ain't never gonna give us no reparations, doc. And they are doing it now. We call them down payments. I can't disclose something that I want to disclose to the audience, but we just got a major grant to deal with reparations. It's the first and one of the largest grants ever given to study reparations for a certain city in this country that all of us know. And I'm leading the research on that. So stay tuned.
What's interesting when you talk about it, because I'm here in the, Northern Virginia, and I'm in the, I guess this is the Civil War area, So we have a major street here named Jefferson Davis Highway, and then we used to have Robert E. Lee High School. They just recently changed that to Unity High School, and I'm all for those changes. They're nice as far as symbolism, but I'd rather see changes that are going to really positively impact our people, economically. Changing Jefferson Davis Avenue won't really affect me that much. I've gotten used to it being Jefferson Davis Avenue, or highway, whatever it's called. But when I think of reparations,
yeah, no, you're right. I mean, Derek Bell says that oftentimes Black people mistake symbols for substance, and Bobby Wright and I went to school and did our degrees at Chicago. And Bobby Wright used to say, in the 60s, we had this country at his knees. We were burning down cities, Watts, Harlem, Newark, Cleveland, where I'm from. And they asked us what we wanted. And we said, well, we want you to name South Park Avenue after Dr. King. What we should have asked for was radio stations, TV stations, and the substance. So I'm all for them changing, tearing down the statues. That ain't bad, okay?
Right.
But I want something more tangible. And I think those tangible things are the forms of reparations that we need to get. And there's partial disagreement within the reparation activist community about what are those forms, but all of us agree that we are deserving of justice in the form of reparations.
Now, I have a kind of a two-part question here in terms of reparations. First part, what about our own internal organization? Because as we struggle to get reparations, how do we organize ourselves internally to deal with those reparations? And two, there's and how do we? Because I'm sort of a Pan-Africanist out of the Kwame Ture School of Pan-Africanism, and in many ways, the reparations is a international for all Africans. How do we connect this reparations on an international basis as opposed to kind of becoming narrow and saying my group and your group and that sort of thing?
Well, those are both good questions. The last question is this, is that there's a group now called ADOS who are opposed to reparations for everybody except Black folk in America. The reparations struggle has always been international. It's always been international. And we have reparations activists all through the diaspora. David Comishong down in Barbados, Sir Hilary Beckles has written a book, Black Britain's Debt, that talks about it. I gave a lecture at the University of Edinburgh. I didn't know it was that many Black activists in Scotland, a couple years ago. and you know, what's the sister's name in England? I can't call her name right now. Esther Stanford. She's a strong reparations person. So this idea that somehow you only supposed to give reparations for people in America is just ridiculous. And you know, I've been very critical of ADOS, as many others have been that way as well. The first question, Marimba Anita wrote Yorugu. We've talked, and we have to do internal reparations as well. She calls it, it's a Kiswahili word, ayuresa. And the idea is that what do we need to do internally about dealing with some of this mess? So for example, Lil Wayne needs reparations. He don't need the money, but he needs stuff up here. And you know, and Should America Pay? I include brother Wade Nobles, a psychologist, and he has a whole chapter in there about the damage, psychological damage. Him and Joy DeGruy talk a great deal about how we have been damaged by the system of white supremacy psychologically. So when I see this black mayor or black candidate for mayor in Michigan saying that when he becomes mayor of this city, he's going to do away with Black History Month. I said, well, he's out of his black mind. He's just out of his black mind. And I think that that's the damage and the psychological damage that we have to work on within our own communities before, I shouldn't say before, I should say side by side with getting the external reparations as well. We got to get engaged in self-healing. I mean, Clarence Thomas needs reparations, but it's a different kind. It's more psychological. What's this woman, Sister Candace Owens? I don't know if you heard of that.
Yes.
But I mean, they need to be talked to about repairing the damage. This guy, Tim Scott, the senator from South Carolina, they need reparations. So, I mean, they engage with within themselves with a lot of self-hatred. And again, we don't want to call that stuff out. Bobby used to say, it's always very difficult for us to sanction our own people. You know, it's easy for me to point the finger at white folks, but sometimes we got to look at ourselves and say, what am I doing to uphold the system of white supremacy? And I may not even realize I'm doing it.
Now, do you feel like some of those people, and I know we about running out of time, it's such a great conversation, I could go on for a while. Do you feel like some of those people that you've mentioned that need reparations, is it just being a victim of the white supremacy mindset, or are they victims of, what's the syndrome when you sympathize with your captor?
Oh, you talking about Stockholm syndrome?
Stockholm, is it, or the Stockholm syndrome more so? You know, living in the United States and feeling the need to assimilate, and the best way to assimilate is to be like, you know, who's ever in charge, or is it the combination of both?
Well, you know, I mean, real quick, you know, Francis used to say, most Black people are not trying to do battle with the system of white supremacy. They're trying to find a more comfortable place within the system. So what we've got to do, and I tell organizations this too, part of your organization, it shouldn't just be fundraising, although that's important. It shouldn't just be, we're going to feed hungry children. That's important. Part of your organization has to be to fight the system of white supremacy. You got to kick it. You got to, you know, push it at it real hard. And if your organization is not doing that, it's going to be ineffectual. And I think a lot of our we got enough organizations. I mean, every time somebody calls, Doc, can you be the advisor to this group? Can you sit on the board? We got about 1,000 million billion Black organizations on the planet. You know, and that's what Minister Farrakhan a few years ago, we need to organize the organizations and to, not give up your identity, but come together like Fred was doing again, and pull together so that the leadership will be more focused. And we don't engage that much because we're too busy in our own bailiwick saying, well, we got to do this and we got to do it. And I live in Baltimore, and there's a lot of organizations in Baltimore. Some of them are doing the same thing, but that's not unique to Baltimore. It's all over this country. And, maybe we need to call a moratorium on organization.
Now, that would actually be a good note to end on, but I want to ask one final question. Sure. And it's a shame that I even have to ask this question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Can you explain to our listeners why fighting white supremacy is not hate? Because even some of our own people feel that way, like, oh, I don't want to hear this racist rhetoric. Well, can you break that down for the people listening?
Well, that shows the job. See, the system of white supremacy has been partially successful in convincing us that if we love ourselves, we hate white people. And that's not true. Neely Fuller says there's 3 types of people on earth. He said there's people of color, there's white people, and there are white supremacists. I'm not trying to fight. Sorry about that. I'm not trying to fight white people. I'm trying to fight white supremacy. And some people confuse us saying fighting white supremacy with fighting white people. It ain't the same thing. Not all white people are white supremacists. Who are the white supremacists? I don't know. In that sense, you're guilty until proven innocent. But I know that we oftentimes try to protect white people against, I could tell a story, but we ain't got time. But, I've seen it in front of, my own eyes that black people will defend white people even though they are wrong about certain things. And if you say, look, man, you need to focus on helping black folk, well, that means we hate white people. You don't hate white people. I hate white supremacy. And I try to fight against that system. But I don't hate white folks. I ain't gonna give them that much energy.
And I think that's the perfect note to end on. So, Dr. Ray Winbush, we want to thank you for joining us, brother. And
thanks for inviting me. Yeah,
I could have done this for 2 hours. So, on behalf of myself, the OG, Dr. Neil Holmes, again, we want to thank you. Great message, great conversation. For those watching, thank you for supporting us. If you haven't seen Judas and the Black Messiah, please see that movie, learn about Fred Hampton and what this brother did. And especially if you're a young person in college, it may inspire you, to, as Kwame Ture used to say, help us, organize us. It may inspire you. So thanks again, Dr. Winbush.
Thank you.
Everybody that's supporting us, thank you.
I'll keep up the good work too.
All right, appreciate that. Take care.